History of the United States. The territory represented by the continental United States had, of course, been discovered perhaps several times before the voyages of Christopher Columbus. When Columbus arrived, he found the New World inhabited by peoples who in all likelihood had originally come from the continent of Asia. Probably, these first inhabitants had arrived 20,000 to 35,000 years before in a series of migrations from Asia to North America by way of the Bering Strait. By the time the first Europeans appeared, the indigenous people, commonly referred to as Indians, had spread and occupied all portions of the New World. The foods and other resources available in each physiographic region largely determined the type of culture prevailing there. Fish and sea mammals, for example, contributed the bulk of the food supply of coastal peoples, although the acorn was a staple for California Indians. Plant life and wild game, especially the American bison or buffalo, were sources for the Plains Indians, and small game hunting and fishing, depending again on local resources, provided for Midwestern and Eastern American Indian groups. These foods were supplemented by corn, which was a staple food for the Indians of the Southwest. The procurement of this food called for the employment of fishing, hunting, plant and berry gathering, and farming techniques, the application of which depended, in turn, upon the food resources utilized in given areas. Food and other raw materials likewise conditioned the material culture of the respective regional groups. All Indians transported goods by human carrier. The use of dogs to pull sleds or travois was widespread, and rafts, boats, and canoes were used where water facilities were available. The horse, imported by the Spanish in the early 16th century, was quickly adopted by the Indians once it had made its appearance. Notably, it came to be used widely by the buffalo hunting Indians of the Great Plains. American Indian culture groups were distinguished among other ways by house types. Dome-shaped ice houses, igloos, were developed by the Eskimos, called Inuit in Canada, in what would become Alaska. Rectangular plank houses were produced by the Northwest Coast Indians, earth and skin lodges and chips by plains and prairie tribes, flat-roofed and often multi-storied houses by some of the Pueblo Indians of the Southwest, and barrel houses by the Northeast Indians. Clothing, or the lack of it, likewise varied with native groups, as did crafts, weapons, and tribal economic, social, and religious customs. At the time of Columbus' arrival, there were probably roughly 1.5 million American Indians in what is now the continental United States, although estimates vary greatly. In order to assess the role and the impact of the American Indian upon the subsequent history of the United States in any meaningful way, one must understand the differentiating factors between Native American peoples, such as those mentioned above. Generally speaking, it may be said, however, that the American Indians as a whole exercised an important influence upon the civilization transplanted from Europe to the New World. Indian foods and herbs, articles of manufacture, methods of raising some crops, war techniques, words, a rich folklore, and ethnic infusions are among the more obvious general contributions of the Indians to their European conquerors. The protracted and brutal westward moving conflict caused by white expansionism and Indian resistance constitutes one of the most tragic chapters in the history of the United States. The English colonization of North America was but one chapter in the larger story of European expansion throughout the globe. The Portuguese, beginning with a voyage to Porto Santo of the coast of West Africa in 1418, were the first Europeans to promote overseas exploration and colonization. By 1487, the Portuguese had traveled all the way to the southern tip of Africa, establishing trading stations at Arguin, Sierra Leone, and Elmine. In 1497, Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope and sailed up the eastern coast of Africa, laying the groundwork for Portugal's later commercial control of India. By 1500, when Pedro Alvarez Cabral stumbled across the coast of Brazil en route to India, Portuguese influence had expanded to the New World as well. Though initially lagging behind the Portuguese in the arts of navigation and exploration, the Spanish quickly closed that gap in the decades following Columbus' voyage to America. First in the Caribbean and then in spectacular conquests of New Spain and Peru. They captured the imagination and the envy of the European world. France, occupied with wars in Europe to preserve its own territorial integrity, was not able to devote as much time or effort to overseas expansion as did Spain and Portugal. Beginning in the early 16th century, however, French fishermen established an outpost in Newfoundland, and in 1534, Jacques Cartier began exploring the Gulf of St. Lawrence. By 1543, the French had ceased their efforts to colonize the northeast portion of the New World. In the last half of the 16th century, France attempted to found colonies in Florida and Brazil, but each of these efforts failed, and by the end of the century, Spain and Portugal remained the only two European nations to have established successful colonies in America. The English, although eager to duplicate the Spanish and Portuguese successes, nevertheless lagged far behind in their colonization efforts. The English possessed a theoretical claim to the North America mainland by dint of the 1497 voyage of John Cabot of the coast of Nova Scotia, but in fact they had neither the means nor the desire to back up that claim during the 16th century. Thus, it was that England relied instead on private trading companies, which were interested principally in commercial rather than territorial expansion to defend its interests in the expanding European world. The first of these commercial ventures began with the formation of the Muscovy Company in 1554. In 1576-78, the English mariner Martin Frobisher undertook 3 voyages in search of a northwest passage to the Far East. In 1577, Sir Francis Drake made his famous voyage around the world, plundering the western coast of South America en route. A year later, Sir Humphrey B. Gilbert, one of the most dedicated of Elizabethan imperialists, began a series of ventures aimed at establishing permanent colonies in North America. All his efforts met with what was at best limited success. Finally, in September 1583, Gilbert with 5 vessels and 260 men disappeared in North Atlantic. With the failure of Gilbert's voyage, the English turned to a new man,